Good afternoon, gentle readers. Today is September 29th, 2024. So from a desk with Ross Finlayson here in Seattle, Washington, is today's episode to be recorded of Moment and Motion. The idea today is that it's almost getting defined in these talks what moment and motion each are, what they are, how to define them at all in terms of that. Otherwise, in terms of each other, moment is not defined in terms of motion, and motion is not defined in terms of moment. Yet they are as well complementary duals. You can't have a moment in motion as it's about the absence or the axis of motion and changes. And you can't have motion in a moment because it essentially reflects that there's the stasis of it, the dependency of it, the loftiness of it, the static of it. And so with regards to statics and dynamics and points and spaces, another good example of this kind of thing, and perspective and projection as these sorts of reverses. Moment and motion are complementary duals. That as duals, they reflect a duality. So the duality that they reflect is in of that either one attains to the other, yet they're not necessarily as so complete each to the other either way, each other, moment and motion. So this is usual enough in terms of geometry that a line is made of points, and points make a line in terms of the higher and lower dimensional apparatus as it is. Yet there's no way to make a line out of points and no way to make points out of a line. And this would usually be the notion of using a pencil and pricking the paper enough times to make enough points on the line, in a line, that actually fill the line. It could be dense over the course of infinitely many applications of this act, this fate, this opus, this work, but it'll never be complete. So line drawing itself is what is figured as this way, that it's the simplest way to model domain, discrete, range, continuous, 0, 1, infinity, 0, 1, 0, 1, infinity, discrete, continuous. That's the way it is. So that's very well addressed in some of these discussions about it. And then with regards to moment and motion, particularly it says with regards to the philosophers. So the philosophers kind of intends to recount that there's our canon. And so our canonry is that which is associated with the ideal of the bibliography. And so when all of recorded history is science and philosophy of science and philosophy of mathematics, for example, points at Aristotle as common ground, then that helps establish that something is along these lines so canonical. And so we adhere to it pretty much dogmatically. It's according to our dogma and our doctrine, that the doctrinacy, as it is of this, is as with regards to our study of it, and it's being thoroughly, not just a kind of like the idea of the realm of higher cognition or reason, but the purported study of the school, the entire tower of results. So that's not a most unusual thing. And what it reflects on here is that since time of antiquity, there is Aristotle's unmoved mover. And basically what he has, that for any kind of motion to appear, it would have to be the result of some other motion, giving it motion. And so this reflects on our balance and conservation of all these things. And it gets into that there's no unmoved mover as an idea that from our first principles and final cause, that everything would have to be the final cause. And that's how it kind of works out, that they're not necessarily kind of first principles, because God only had to roll one dice once to kind of get things rolling. And then as with regards to all the final causes, that they are all final causes because we have ex falso nihilum, so there's never anything else that happens except what is and what's so and what's real and what's true. So I was kind of inspired to think about it that way as I was reading some more of these medieval philosophers. So I've been reading this book I found, and it has some excerpts or pieces from the times of the University of Paris in the medieval times. And so what this follows was basically the Enlightenment, the Islamic Enlightenment. So for hundreds of years, the center of the world's learning was Mesopotamia and that part of the world and Araby. And so who we point to kind of is Avicenna, Averroes or Ibn Rushd, and then also Maimonides, a Jewish Arab, also called Rabbi Moses, that after the Tanaim, or since the rabbinical, after the Second Revolt, or in the times of the advent of Christianity, or 0 AD, from about 70 to 200 AD, 500 years later until the end of the Roman Empire, and then off into the other Abrahamic corner, the Islam, which has its particular traits relevant to the philosophy of sort of the voluntary submission to the higher order and the highest order, monism, and these other things, which of course can be held up as true, and that every aspect of a belief system has some aspect of truth to it. So in those times, then you can also reflect that they were Augustinians, and so Augustine is a great philosopher among the 500 AD, and then they're all Aristotelian. And then it then has that, so that Ibn Rushd or Averroes came out with better or more aligned to the Aristotelian. And then it's so that Aristotle is kind of a fuller Aristotleanism, because Aristotle's works kind of have everything assembled in them that was purported to carry down. And so it's more relevant. So the kind of his thought experiments with regards to cause and causality and motion for physics and the metaphysis and this kind of thing. Then as with regard to, for example, the catalog of fishes, the secrets of secrets, and these kinds of things, which are still part of philosophy, how people think, what they think, and these kinds of things, but not so much the technical philosophy. It's like, how is their thought? What is reason and rationality and this kind of stuff? So then I was reading this some more, these medieval philosophers. And so last time that it was being discussed here was with regards to Peter of Spain, and then Albert the Great, and then after Grosseteste and theories of light, and then the infinite and the aliquot parts. So then I got up to reading some of Aquinas and Duns Scotus, and then so Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus and then William of Occam are kind of collected together as a club of a like time and place. And then there's that Aquinas is Aristotelian, and so what they did then is when they were trying to figure out the root cause of everything, so it was all in relation to dogmatically to deism. And as that the omni, that which is the universal and infinite, is also referred to as the absolute or the Godhead. That as from this springs all other springs. From this is the utmost and everything that there is. And it's the same kind of idea here as addressed in the cyclic metaphysic as the silver thread, kind of the silver thread of time, and the golden braid of space that goes back forever and goes on forever, and this kind of thing. And then as with regards to Thomas Aquinas, what he does is entertains Aristotle's notions of the unmoved mover, and so he uses it basically to establish kind of a proof of there must be this supreme mover of some sort. then here that's reflected as well, that can be considered as a gift of a voluntary submission to an idea, that Aquinas' arguments help make for it so as to how that then is Aristotle's course for picking that as kind of our standard rulio regular way, has then for the schools that you can't reach to it the other ways, like atomism, has basically that Aristotle picked moment instead of motion, or he picked motion instead of moment, where at the same time he incorporates and embodies and expounds upon both of these concepts and their completions either way, and their duality either way in both ways, this wider, fuller dialectic. And as with regards to why then, in the time of, after the Augustinian and then into the scholastics after the Islamic Enlightenment, then into after the Dark Ages and the Black Death and the Plague and this kind of stuff of before this, then as with regards to Aquinas is a thorough development of a theory of mechanics, though it's basically framed in terms of a theory with regards to otherwise just the primality of causality, and as its description according to a belief system overall. While that is so, it's so that then reading a lot of the different kinds of discursive arguments from the classic philosophers of this have that is so that it's equi-interpretable as in the technical philosophy for this physics. So then what I really was kind of interested in was John Duns Scotus. So Scotus was a Scot, and then he went into the Franciscan order, the Catholic Church. So Catholic is a word, and it means universal. So it basically means the Catholic Christian Church. And so it's universal in the sense that, as with regards to Christianity, it's basically as of the notions of Christianity. And then as with regards to that, then there's the Roman Catholic Church is not exactly the same institution. And there are many different sorts of branches of that entire Judeo-Christian theology and philosophies, and then more widely the Abrahamic, as after the Zoroastrian, and what's also to be considered as Mithraic, and of the times of about 0 AD, when that kind of Western canon came about, when this portion of the world, which is kind of the crossroads of the Near East, involved the Mithraic and Persian and Zoroastrianism, and then also the Nubian and the Egyptian, and as with regards to the Hebraical, the Phoenicians, the Cretans, by this time all thoroughly Hellenized by the Greeks. And then at this point in time when the Romans had kind of sat in the center, and that in kind of a circuit around it were things like, the Celts and Picts and the pagans of such that times that there were in those places. And then as with regards to the farther east, then as with regards to Temujin, or as with regards to the Khanate of the earlier times, and then as with regards to the wide world of the farther east, with regards to the Index and the Rig Veda and the Upanishad, our oldest surviving oral written traditions, and then as with regards to the Buddhism and such notions as arrive, and all would have arrived together about that same time and place 2,000 years ago. So that just helps kind of make it so that for the philosophical aspects and the canonical aspects, as according to that, is that pretty much everything is like it's Aristotle, and so you got to read Aristotle, and it's Augustinian for some of this technical stuff, and then with regards to that being questions going on in some of the aspects of the religious aspects of otherwise, that's also the authority of what was so, as with regards to today, and what we have instead is for science and scientism and logicist positivism, that there is a great affordance of being able to be agnostic of that, and that it's necessary to be like a conscious, voluntary submission to an ontological commitment to make it so, as with regards to attachment to teleology, first principles, and like a first cause with regards to these final principles or final causes that are technical philosophy. It's going to be thorough and as well independent for its own sake. And that it is as well connected to these greatest arguments as with regards to the unmoved mover and such other notions of the omnia that are part of universals. So eventually arises the considerations, the absolute and the relative. So theory these days is mostly relativistic. And then as with regards to the absolute, it's its own continued consideration. And then is that they're thoroughly forever part and parcel of the same thing. That is a matter for the technical philosophy and among many other philosophies. Here is for matters of mechanics, of the mathematical, the moment and motion. It's just a reflection on that. A lot of the discourse had been framed in terms of it. So I started to read about Scotus. And Scotus was a brilliant young man, and then he went to the Franciscan order, and then he made it for a while to the University of Paris, and he absorbed all these books, and he thoroughly read Aristotle. And then also he thoroughly read from Aristotle whenever Aristotle at least said two things about something, establishing this complementary duals, then he made sure to include that as for either way. And so following after Aquinas, then he sort of made for this unmoved mover bit, and that is finally is just that it would be so with or without one. So he basically makes with or without one. Scotus, thus there is one. So that's why when I say something like, it arrived as from Duns Scotus, that infinity is in the numbers, and not just something that is not in at all. The idea that man is a finite, limited creature and does not have an infinity in them, it's still it is so that according to the dogma since this time, it's possible to describe it as so that it's like, this is one of our analytical bridges. Duns Scotus has established via these means of deductive inference, as according to a bibliographic and historiographic approach to Aristotleanism, that both of these things get put together and made so. And so in this way, it's really quite a thoroughly significant signpost in study of the things as a linear sort of course of development since antiquity, more than 800 years ago, more than 900 years ago, about 1,000 years ago. The Scotus, that among there are some people who follow Aquinas for some reasons, some people who follow William of Occam for some reasons. It's kind of a minimal deductive inference is what you get from William of Occam. It's just like, pick it up or put it down kind of a thing. And then as with regards to Scotus, he's basically has some of the super classical aspects in the paleoclassical that just provide this deductive inference to bring via fuller dialectic as with regards to reason and the language of it, which is this canonical reference, that is so that Duns Scotus is pretty great about that. And then he was a young man when he left this world. Yet by the time he was in his 20s, he had already put that together. And kind of like Galois, for the Galois group, who was just like, this is an aspect of algebra, and it's just a name for a thing. He'd made his place, and as with regards to then that, largely then the church did the rest of bringing that down since then. So that was I was really just reminded that when talking about these notions of the infinitely higher orders of acceleration and moment and motion, because we need some way to approach like the little end of that. It's like, this is this unmoved mover that starts everything. So Aristotle's unmoved mover is at the little end of otherwise our geometric series, which is like force equals mass times acceleration, and Newton's laws and these things which have been being discussed here and kind of brought in and together over time. So it ends up being kind of a relevant touchstone when someone says, well, I'd like really a lot more of a historiographic account of all this kinds of ideas that kind of come into this place if you're going to start making up this big end and little end of the infinite geometric series and start talking about infinitely many higher orders of acceleration, or at least coming down from them. And it's kind of like, well, we kind of have it all, there. I mean, it's kind of in the dustier sections of the stacks, and people are a lot of times are interested in something a little bit less baggage overall, But at the same time, within a few brief pages, it's possible for these things to kind of come together, and so that it makes sense to have all that kind of a one thing, So I found an affinity to this idea about the moment and motion, and then that Aristotle's got two books. So it's kind of like Aquinas came along and is like, I read Aristotle and he says this. And Occam kind of came along and says, well, I read Aristotle and he says that. That's why the one is like, they say what they say. And then Scotus was like, I read both books of Aristotle and he says all this and it's all that. So that's just kind of a way to say that since such time it's possible to put those three together and make them in counterpoint and juxtapose them and establish their contradistinctions and make a fuller dialectic and box out a square of opposition and arrive at such sort of these complementary duals, singular to each other, yet multiplicities to each other. In this theory, and quite technically, philosophy, logic, mathematics, physics, science, statistics, all via, and without needing all the baggage, yet there's yet this bright silver thread, and it's somehow this eternal golden braid, as it were, a plate of the three space dimensions in array of time. These are also ordinary and regular concepts, since the oldest recorded history have from both the Vedics and the Indics, and a lot about the Middle Egyptians, or 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. These were the same considerations. The same pyramids, according to the same scheme, exist around the world since prehistoric times. Now, that's not saying much more as this with regards to this canon and dogma, because what we have is recorded history. So that the canon is what we have as recorded history. The rest is a matter of archaeology. So our paleoclassical includes everything and up to the very most modern days, latest and greatest scientisms, logical positivisms, axiomatic theory. And then it's remarkably unified is what it is. And then we just still call that, just like Augustine did and the scholastics did and the Enlightenment thinkers did, Platonism. Platonism is the idea that there are the ideals. Now, ideals is another great concept, just kind of mentioned several times in the previous talk here, because there are ideals and the ideals and the ideals. And so with regards to an ideal, there's like a regularity to it. So, and according to a regularity, then it works out an ideal so that it's arithmetic and geometric in proportion of form. And so then between kind of there's geometry and motion. Geometry is motion. With regards to perspective and projection, between that any given observer has both got a perspective on a projection and is a perspective on a projection, and has a perspective to a projection, as about a perspective and a projection, the projective, that it goes a long way to help establish that while the origin is everywhere, and it's sort of like an origin as an observer, that the only way to see one or two of them is as from a different one. So that just goes to saying that the ideals then are what also are closely related with the invariance. No matter how you look at it, it's dimensionless. It's fixed quantity. It's constant. These kinds of things. The ideals. One of the first physics laws we learned that's this kind of form of proportion is the ideal gas law. PV equals nRT. What it does is relates pressure and volume and temperature together. So basically has that no matter how you squeeze it, pressure and volume and temperature are so linearly related as by PV equals nRT. And learning that's like, well, that is ideal. It's remarkably so and efficient for all these sorts of things. And then as with regards to the empirical and like the steam tables, live and cool, the triple points of freezing and boiling, or cooling and chilling, and all these kind of aspects that get into usually the empirical milieu, largely associated with fire and water in terms of combustion and steam, that was the driver for hundreds of years of all of the need for the empirical tables of things, with regards to that being the largely the technological development that enabled the great changes that the Earth has seen over a couple hundred years. So, mentioning the ideals, then, that there are things that are ideal according to these regularities, and then in the wider milieu, they have there's more ideals, and so this idea is that the classical formalism is an ideal, and there was that great talk about all the history of the definition of momentum after inertia, and the V viva and the V motrix and the vis incida, these concepts of force and power and later work and according to motion and acceleration and these things about what were the ideals and this severe abstraction, which is of ideals, and mechanical reduction is of ideals, that was arrived at these classical considerations for this one perspective, this one fixed point, as with regards to that there's fixed point and limit points of a sort. It was with regards to ideals and wider ideals, the inner and outer products about these things. So that's not to say that the ideal is underdefined or that the classical is contrived, because it's still the result of kind of like this is our mark, and it is most accurate. It's not inaccurate at all from a given perspective at a given moment. It's then trying to figure out these wider ideals, this sum of histories, sum of potentials, and that resulting, yet the ideal. It has that's so necessary when we already have a very successful theory of the electron orbitals as ideals, the gas law as ideal, as following the statistical mechanics as ideals, and the statistical ensemble for that in the subatomic and the quantum particles, those being kind of ideals, getting a little let out in the atomic level of the Planck and the trans-Planckian regime, as we can only kind of tweeze by angstroms, and these ideas as with regards to yet even variation around the triple points of water, boiling and freezing, or as with regards to other things that are ideals in controlled circumstances that instead see variations. And then as well, particularly for these super classical laws of large numbers, for laws of emergence that arrive extra laws of convergence, that besides what our laws of convergence would arrive at for summing up all these infinitely small things that we've given a finite value to, and saying that we've been able to add them back up, and then saying that would have a finite sum as well again, that it's different, that we have these things going on with the doubling spaces and having spaces and doubling measures and having measures, and as with regards to the continuous and discrete and the analog and the digital, that these are the higher mathematics coming back down again, to where they have been forever, but in the ideal, once it was left behind, kind of like that first part of the term, mv or mv squared, that second order that it was left to be ideal, that then trying to figure out how to pick that up is like, it's one thing to try and pick it up way later in the theory, and it's another to have to figure out how it's can be consistently and thoroughly together, as revisiting these decisions in doctrine or dogma since ancient times, in medieval times, and today, with the greatest and latest scientific experiments of the greatest and latest premier theories of physics and science and statistics according to at least one law of large numbers in the Bayesian and others, which are less defined and less explored and less understood. And physics, a field theory, a gauge theory, and a theory of some histories and theory of some potentials. And mathematics, a geometry, a number theory, arithmetic and algebra, and function theory and topology, all in theory, set theory or ordering theory. Either way, model theory and proof theory. That's mathematics for you, both, either way. Foundations in mathematics. Then there's logic, of course. True, false. How about we just start with true or false and arrive at both in the other so that they're both already there. This is the idea of this Comenius language. He was an educator. He tried to convince everybody that it was a good idea for everybody to get educated and get literate, and it really changed the face and the world of society, of course, hundreds of years ago. That the idea is that there's there is this truth. And then that relates also all the way back to these theories that are more dogmatically associated with the deistic, that are these absolutes, universals, and what must be so, and then the omnia is with regards to considerations in numerology and the gematria and the Kabbalah and the theory of words, representations, metonymy, the strong metonymy. And then the idea is with regards to, for example, first there was a space of geometry, and then there was a space of words and algebra. That these have the same meaning technically as they do just abstractly, and much the same deliberation. So that's rather grandiose, but it's just a matter of speaking to that. The mechanics of motion still is underdefined, and then the tracks and the courses of what's the ideal has been following what it is as from what arises from all these different constituent notions that go into this entire side of the dialectic with regards to relativity, very, very, very broadly. That the absolute and relative in theory, and it's what's relative and what's absolute basically defines an ideal, and then that at least gives a place to stand for then our lever of mathematics to apply to something like that. Then in this wider course, it's what are these non-classical, extra-classical, super-classical results that bring it back around together, and that is of great interest to those who want A, no paradoxes in the theory, B, a thorough theory, and C, a consistent and complete and diverse and various theory, consistent and complete and constant and concrete, the theory. And then as with regards to that's thoroughly sufficient to have a mathematics with geometry and numbers. And then also for our algebra and our arithmetic on it for these numbers and geometry and numbers and their spaces of words and spaces of points. And then also what functions and topois are between them, the relations and the ranges, as it were, all in mathematics. And then that being fundamentally, foundationally, and formally is via theory with one relation, like set theory or ordering theory. One where things are related and one where they are not, or how they are so, and variously. With regards to the distinction between ordering theory and set theory for numbers and counting, while as with regards to the combinatorics on the set theory side, because more than one object can relate in set theory in the same way, while objects that relate to the same object in ordering theory don't relate to each other the same way. So without much more than that, as far as I figured out, that is kind of what I see as the footprint of mathematical theory that it has to be. And then that it's all one theory is like, it is that sort of arrived at via these deductive principles. And then with as regards to being kind of conscious and thoroughly diligent about that, then I can pretty fairly for myself, because I can't speak for other people in that sense, voluntary submit my ontological commitment and my attachment to the absolute, to that. It's included, see? And then it's just kind of conceived or perceived as a gift. So, I've been reading these medieval philosophers a little bit. Let's see where I left off here. Done Scotus. He's talking about the primary and immediate truth, immediate truths through some immediate truth. So it's like it's got to be related immediately and then eventually. Those being the two kinds of things. And as with regards to something that's like not first false, one of the fellows on the board says this idea is like, well, induction can never be first false or else it fails. So this inductive case that's not first false will never fail. And it's kind of so, according to inductive inference. And then the other idea is like, well, some things according to inductive, if there's an example of an inductive case that fails, it means it's ultimately untrue. And so the idea that not ultimately untrue suffices for both not first false and not ultimately untrue. It's kind of like these things in the modality of all the considerations, why something like the word yet always suffices for an expression that something is so and something is not so at the same time, whether independent or unrelated, or that they're dependent and related. Whereas but instead says something is so, but something else is not so, and thus it's not so. So that there can only be like one of these ideas that in the wider absolute theory, there's no but, only yet. There's ifs and ands, and yet. So these immediate truths, someone were able to conceive a triangle, not according to its proper notion as a triangle, but only under the notion of figure, abstracted from a quadrangle. It would be impossible for him to grasp that property by which a triangle is the first of plane geometrical figures, because this property could be conceived only if it were abstracted from a triangle itself. He could, however, abstract the notion of first from other things that are first, e.g. of numbers. Although his intellect could form the proposition some figure is first, because it could grasp the terms involved, still such a proposition would be neutral to him, because it is immediate proposition included in this immediate proposition. See here, it kind of reminds that Scotus in this development, he's describing things that, besides true and false, when things are knowns, then there's true, false, and things like don't know, don't care, null, void, maybe so, maybe not, varies. These kinds of cases and conditions that here he's establishing for kind of an abstract of an inference system. He's making a logic that these things that come together in the logic that he's making help establish their relation to the very well-known and explored logic and the very widely explored logic of many, many other thinkers to whom this would have to be relevant, and all relevant together, relations to other matters of usual considerations of form and proportion. What came first, the triangle or the square? Well, if what came first was a figure with the least number of sides, it's a triangle. And if what came first is a figure that's made out of a lattice of quadrangles, then it would be the square. That it's both, because you can arrive at it either way from trying to get to the other side, both ways, both sides. It's kind of a thing. Then here with regards to triangles and the idea whether the Pythagorean triangles are rational sides or that triangles have irrational sides is another sort of idea that they're transcendental. Because what's irrational to the one side is just from the transcendental side, where it's maintaining the form and proportion, its own kind of rulio, its own kind of ideal. That they can meet in the middle, kind of like, well, integers, we divide those up and their relations all arrayed in perspective and projection result real numbers. It's like no, so you can say we took real numbers, and by the way as they all fall in together and form their modularity and come back down, they make integers. It's absolute and relative, and the origin is everywhere, and there's only one. Gets into these things like the only constant is change. Truisms, which eventually, when conflated, confused, and confounded, it result not saying much at all, but at the same time, result always having to be said. So, not that much to it. And so, then he just arrives at what's his grounds for induction. But he's got a pretty thorough dialectical discourse as to why this ponderance, deliberate ponderance and deliberation of these things, and his contemplation and deliberation on these things, is bringing to him what are the terms, as with regards to the terms, predicates or propositions, and relations. And then, of course, according to the tradition and the context here, whenever something gets involved that invokes a universal, then it's just theistic, which thoroughly, it fuses together these aspects, it founds together these aspects, and it reflates all these things together. It combines all the things together as what are absolute. Breaking that down is for this deconstructive account, then this structural and reconstructivist again, because it was already. Fourth argument is this: whatever is ordered to some end toward which it is not disposed must be gradually disposed for this end. So this is kind of like this not ultimately untrue bit. This is part of Scotus's bringing in deductive inference, and that when there's an inductive impasse either way, lines are not made of points and points do not make a line. When they meet in the middle of nowhere, these complementary duals is part of discussion in this context since the last several hundred hours of this, according to some tens of thousands of essays before that. But here, with regards to this, is just pointing out that then after Scotus put this down, that in the entire world, when there are only like 500 books left or whatever for a while, in terms of what was then printed and reprinted and came out of that or something like that, and that's an arbitrarily small number, and it doesn't reflect accurately what there is or are, that this contained enough in the definition to have then somebody put in their bibliography, and it's like so. And Scotus says infinity is in, and he read both books of Aristotle, so it's okay. Because otherwise, without that, then it's kind of like trying to make an attribution where none exists, and then it's just like free of opinion. When otherwise, for this kind of academic school vis-a-vis this scientific framework, anybody can be a scientist, but you got to be academic to be academic. That's the way things are. But if it be objected that a perfect agent can remove any imperfection immediately, can act immediately, I reply that even if it could do so by its absolute power, still it is more perfect to make the creature active in attaining its perfection than to deprive it of any such activity. But man could have some activity in the attainment of his final perfection. Hence it is more perfect than such that such be given him. But this could not be done without imparting some imperfect knowledge, which precedes that perfect knowledge which he is ultimately destined to possess. So this is just going further, saying we are limited human creatures. We got the human condition, which makes us as, with alive and a soul and all that kind of stuff, and intelligence, and for each other, thoroughly, widely, and that kind of thing. While at the same time saying that, and he mentioned specifically, we attain to this higher ideals. And so then insofar as then it's largely agreed, something like the circle is a perfect circle. That is so for everybody. And it is perfect. And it is Platonic. It's strongly Platonic. And as far as strong mathematical Platonists agree, they might agree that it's the same for everybody. It has its own interobjective existence for very strongly a realist position, while still that all such manners of theory are entirely open to subjectivity, and that there is a multiverse of all the theories in the world, and one of those that nobody quite knows is just that one theory of the world. This is where, speaking earlier of the Islamic Enlightenment, there was Newton wrote a system of the world, and before him Kepler wrote a system of the world, and then before him, as Averroes wrote, heavens in the world. So it's kind of like, a progression here of what's learned and brought in or brought down. While still so, it doesn't take too much of a lunchbox to have enough of a grab bag to have a mental toolkit that then you can arrive at, well, what I intend to discover are these relations among 0, 1, and infinity, and then be able to keep those square in a sense, even though everybody knows that infinity is not to scale when it's drawn in the drawing. Yet that something that tips over from 0 to 1 has this moved mover that's at least infinitely many higher orders of acceleration and falls down. So it just goes so far to say that, well, it's dogmatically that since Duns Scotus, that's given, exists, does not need so much further. It's, like a philosophy or a theory behind it, as just to relate and reflect it onto logicism and positivism, because positivism very strongly relates us like we are human finite creatures, and you can't just be making stuff up out of air. We are Aristotelians with their unmoved movers as far as it goes. This uses the same arguments of Aristotle as from that time to bring those together, and as to why it's still strongly logicist and positivist, see? Because that's the way our theory is today. We went through stuff like the Vienna Circle and Carnap and all that kind of thing. So it's given to them. And it's not necessarily so that we need to take an entire roundabout route through existentialism, nihilism, and Derrida, and postmodernist deconstruction and disfigurism, when we can instead arrive at a postmodernist deconstruction and restructuralism as with regards to if this is disfigurist at all, reading Scotus this way for his reading of Aristotle and then attaching it to otherwise the aspects of the canon for these aspects related to either are perceived destined and required or otherwise conscious or unconscious voluntary or involuntary submission of an ontological commitment to these things, that we can still have one this way while still being quite all modernly urbane logical positivists and such. So looking a bit through here, then I'm just kind of scanning through some of the Duns Scotus. The difference between these two ways in which revealed knowledge is called supernatural is apparent if we consider each separately. Thus, if a supernatural agent would cause the knowledge of some natural object, for example, if it infused the knowledge of geometry in someone, this would be supernatural in the first way, but not the second. What is supernatural in the second way, however, is supernatural in both ways. For the second way implies the first, but not vice versa. However, where there is only the first type of supernatural, e.g. infused geometry, It is not impossible that what is supernatural could have been produced naturally under other conditions. Where something is supernatural. In the second way, however, it is necessary that it be produced supernaturally, since it could not possibly be produced naturally. And that's just, it's got a very regular attachment of de natura, de res, and de natura as de facto. And so then reading back a bit to kind of discern his kinds or types here. In what sense potentiality, it is called natural if it is naturally inclined toward the form it receives. So here the sum of history is sum of potentials approaches that everything is natural. So in this sense, one can make a consideration that the supernatural is natural again. It's absolutely so. And then we attain to it. And then as we attain to it from different ideals and various ideals, that our ideals are still formed as from regularities, the rules, and the laws of numbers, of physics, the rules, what's regular. And then as with regards to these kinds of things, that the definition, just like adding infinity, is just like adding just the least necessary idea of this golden thread and attachment to everything else because everything else can be angels dancing on the head of a pin, as many as you want, because it's all of them could fit that camel through the eye of a needle. These being two usual ideas: how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, the usual idea being 0 or 1 or more, and then how many camels can thread the eye of a needle. It's like, well, 0, yeah. What about that one? Yeah. So these are just reflections on that. Scotus is making a differentiation, but it's given either side of this dialectic account of the discussion on the deductive, for that he's associating it with the unmoved mover and some of these other things that Aquinas is also talking about. That this way it helps to bring together that he's as well. It's that is still at the point of infinity. In virtue of these, consequently, supernatural knowledge is not necessary according to the common law. Thusly, we have common laws that combine to make a common law, and not so much just like, what was it? It's like Hammurabi's law, or like the Magna Carta or something like that. These artifacts of our social contracts, what it's talking about is the laws of numbers and the laws of geometry, the laws of physics, as vis-a-vis regards the law of logic. The logic. Not that those aren't necessarily related, law and logic, or logic and logos, or the word. Because law is usually given as being Old English and Teutonic in a sense, struth and law, whereas logic and logos is usually considered as more the Greek in the etymology of those words. Whereas logos is pre-Hellenic, So, thusly, through this lens of having to read to extract from these medieval philosophers what was their lens as with regards to the technical content vis-a-vis the matters of discourse, or as St. Bonaventure, whatever you put it, is like there's grammar to say something at all, and logic to make a point, and then rhetoric to persuade somebody. That these kinds of approaches to communication and words and all that kind of stuff, of course, are still so profound as canonical, dogmatic in our doctrine, that they're not necessarily attached to any kind of ontological commitment necessarily to monotheism and sectarianism, while as well it's offered at least a monism, and then that voluntary submission and belief in the ontological commitment is what one gives, and that's as regards usual notions of what's called voluntary submission and humility, or the hubris, and that's part of belief systems overall, and then when they're related, the placement of being or belief in same kind of terms, they really are talking about the same thing. So there's much more to be garnered from reading Scotus. He mentions Henry of Ghent. A power regards as its object only those things of which the notion of its first object is verified, and anything which its notion is verified. So this is that there's an unmoved mover, and then there's the moving mover, is as with regards to this flow of the moment in motion. Because at some point in time in this dynamics, it's at rest. Relatively, everything else in the universe is in motion. Well, it's at rest, whether it's absolute or relative itself, whether it's distinct or discrete or continuous itself, and as with regards to where it isn't. And that our current school and entire development and linear curriculum has arrived at largely always relativity. And then as with regards to something like Einstein's relativity, where he gets more specific, because those notions are conjoined, they're conflated, they're confused, they're confounded. That Einstein says something like, well, there's no absolute motion. It's like, well, is there absolute space? And he's like, well, there's no absolute motion. Then it can help us understand that that's really all the attachment that there is to the theory, relativity. And then as Einstein put it, he's like, can such a negative statement really mean so much? He's like, yeah, he makes it ideal. And then leaves for others to figure out, the Mach-ian is generally called, the next outer bit of that. It's more ideal, while at the same time having sorted out this deconstructive account from what's confused and conjoined and conflated and confounded, where those words usually mean also and logically, intractably ambiguous together, to make them apart again and assembled again as to where that being joined and founded and fused and flated are a good thing, and express these rounds of ideals, this kind of tetrad of quantities, or tetrad of propensities and tendencies, that make it up for so that then there's these aspects and for the absolute and relative and 0, 1, and infinity, and the four forces or four fields of physics, that it's possible to actually just kind of start breaking that out. Then with regards to number theory and geometry and then set theory and ordering theory, and set theory and part theory, and ordering theory and theory of equalities and tautology. That is kind of where this is arriving at. That today in moment of motion, there's not much said, except that moment doesn't say much about motion, and motion doesn't say much about moment. They're not so much the ideals to each other. They're the duals to each other, that together have to be framed as of these ideals, and together have to be tussled apart and considered for their pseudo elementary and their quasi otherwise they're elements together, and that somehow it's just still only one theory. That's foundations for you. Well, good afternoon, gentle readers. moment in motion. Geometry is motion.